You're eating less than you ever have in your life. You skipped breakfast, had a salad for lunch, and still managed to say no to dessert at dinner. And yet, the belly is still there. Maybe it's even bigger than it was 5 years ago. You step on the scale and the number barely moves. You start wondering if your body is broken. Or worse, you start thinking maybe this is just what getting older looks like and there's nothing you can do about it. But here's the truth. Your body isn't broken. It's changed. And dieting the same way you did at 25 is never going to work the same way again. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the rules have completely shifted. Today, we're going to go through exactly what happens inside the body after 40 that makes belly fat so stubborn, and more importantly, what actually works to fight it. Let's start with the first thing most people don't realize. After 40, your metabolism doesn't just slow down a little, it changes in a very specific way that targets fat storage around the midsection. When you're younger, your body runs on a fairly efficient hormonal system. Insulin sensitivity is high, meaning your cells respond quickly to glucose and use it for energy. Cortisol, your stress hormone, spikes when needed and drops back down fast. Growth hormone, which helps your body burn fat and repair muscle, runs at solid levels through the night. Everything is working together. Then you hit your late 30s and early 40s, and the hormonal landscape starts to shift, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly. For women, estrogen begins to decline as perimenopause sets in. For men, testosterone levels start dropping roughly 1 to 2% every year after 30. These aren't small changes. These hormones have a direct relationship with how and where your body stores fat. Here's what estrogen does that most people don't know. In younger women, estrogen actually helps the body store fat in the hips and thighs, what's called peripheral fat storage. That fat, while frustrating, is metabolically safer. When estrogen starts dropping, the body shifts fat storage patterns. It starts pulling fat away from the hips and redistributing it around the abdomen and the organs. This is called visceral fat, and it's the dangerous kind. It wraps around the liver, the intestines, and the stomach, and unlike the fat under your skin, visceral fat is metabolically active. It produces inflammatory compounds and disrupts insulin signaling on its own. It's not just sitting there, it's making the problem worse the longer it stays. For men, declining testosterone has a similar effect. Testosterone helps the body maintain lean muscle mass. When it drops, muscle mass decreases, even if you're not doing anything differently. Less muscle means the body burns fewer calories at rest, and since fat doesn't burn calories the way muscle does, the body composition shifts. More fat, less muscle, slower metabolism. And again, the place that fat tends to accumulate is the belly. Now, let's talk about the second major reason belly fat becomes resistant after 40, and this one catches most people off guard. It's not just what you eat, it's what your body does with stress. Cortisol is your body's primary stress hormone. When something stressful happens, a work deadline, a difficult conversation, even a hard workout, your brain signals the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Cortisol does several things. It raises blood sugar to give you quick energy, it suppresses non-essential functions like digestion and immune response, and it signals the body to hold on to fat reserves, particularly around the belly, because the brain interprets stress as a survival threat and wants energy nearby. In younger people, cortisol spikes and then drops fairly quickly. The body recovers fast. But after 40, the cortisol response becomes stickier. Levels take longer to come back down, and if life is consistently stressful, which for most people over 40 with careers, families, financial pressures, and health worries, it tends to be, cortisol can stay chronically elevated for days, weeks, and months at a time. What does chronically elevated cortisol actually do to the belly? It increases fat cell activities specifically in the abdominal region. Fat cells in the belly have a higher concentration of cortisol receptors than fat cells elsewhere in the body. So when cortisol stays high, those cells are getting a constant signal to store more fat. At the same time, high cortisol breaks down muscle tissue, exactly what you don't want when you're already losing muscle to age, and it suppresses growth hormone, which is one of the main hormones responsible for fat burning during sleep. This is why people who are under serious chronic stress will often gain belly fat even when they're eating well. The hormone signal is overriding the calorie math. The third factor is one that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one: insulin resistance. Insulin is the hormone that tells your cells to absorb glucose from the blood and use it for energy. When you eat carbohydrates, blood sugar rises, insulin goes up, cells absorb the glucose, and blood sugar comes back down. That's how it's supposed to work. But after years of modern diets, high in refined carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods, sugary drinks, and irregular eating patterns, the cells start to become resistant to insulin's signal. They stop responding as efficiently. So the pancreas compensates by producing more insulin to get the same result. And here's the problem. High insulin is a fat storage hormone. When insulin is elevated, the body is in storage mode. It's not burning fat, it's locking it away. Insulin resistance gets worse with age, particularly after 40, because it's compounded by the loss of muscle mass. Muscle is the body's primary site for glucose disposal. When you have more muscle, your body clears blood sugar more efficiently. When you lose muscle, glucose stays in the bloodstream longer, insulin stays elevated longer, and the cycle of fat storage continues. The result is that even when someone over 40 is cutting calories and eating what seems like a healthy diet, if that diet is still built around high glycemic foods, bread, rice, pasta, fruit juices, low-fat packaged foods full of sugar, insulin stays chronically elevated and the belly fat doesn't budge. In fact, the calorie restriction can actually make it worse in some cases because aggressive dieting raises cortisol, and cortisol plus high insulin is a perfect storm for abdominal fat storage. So if the old rules don't work, what does? The first shift is moving away from calorie restriction as the primary strategy and toward blood sugar management. This doesn't mean cutting all carbohydrates. It means being strategic about which carbohydrates, when, and in what combination. Eating carbohydrates alongside protein and healthy fat dramatically slows the glucose spike and keeps insulin lower. Choosing whole food sources, legumes, vegetables, whole grains in moderate amounts makes a significant difference in how the body responds. There's also strong research supporting the use of time-restricted eating for people over 40 with insulin resistance. Compressing your eating window, even to a 10 or 12-hour window rather than the more aggressive 16-8, gives the body longer periods of low insulin, which allows fat-burning processes to activate. This isn't about starving yourself. It's about giving the hormonal system the recovery time it needs. The second shift is prioritizing resistance training over cardio. This is counterintuitive for a lot of people who associate fat loss with running and cardio exercise. But for people over 40, building and maintaining muscle mass is the most powerful long-term lever available. Every pound of muscle you add increases your resting metabolic rate. It also improves insulin sensitivity dramatically. Muscle tissue absorbs glucose, which lowers blood sugar and keeps insulin in check. Even 2 to 3 sessions of resistance training per week, done consistently, can produce measurable changes in body composition and insulin sensitivity within 8 to 12 weeks. The third shift is taking cortisol management seriously as a health practice, not as a luxury or an afterthought. Poor sleep is one of the most powerful drivers of elevated cortisol and disrupted growth hormone. Research consistently shows that adults who sleep less than 6 hours per night have significantly higher levels of cortisol, lower testosterone, and greater abdominal fat accumulation than those who sleep 7 to 9 hours. If sleep is poor, no amount of dieting or exercise will fully overcome the hormonal disruption it causes. Stress management in the traditional sense matters too, not just meditation and deep breathing, though those have documented effects on cortisol. Even simpler things like walking in nature, reducing screen time at night, keeping consistent sleep and wake times, and managing overcommitment all directly affect cortisol regulation and, by extension, belly fat. The fourth factor is one that's gaining more attention in research right now, and it's the gut microbiome. The bacteria living in your digestive system play a surprisingly large role in metabolic health, weight regulation, and inflammation. After 40, the diversity of the gut microbiome tends to decline, driven by diet, antibiotic use, stress, and reduced physical activity. A less diverse microbiome has been associated with increased inflammation, worse insulin sensitivity, and greater tendency to store fat. Fermented foods like plain yogurt, kefir, kimchi, and sauerkraut, as well as high-fiber foods that feed beneficial bacteria, have shown meaningful effects on metabolic markers in middle-aged adults. This isn't a magic solution, but it's a real piece of the puzzle that most people aren't addressing. Here's what it all comes down to. Belly fat after